Assalamu alaikum, guys. So moving on to the actual studies, the therapeutic evidence we have, it's conclusive evidence for the fact that it can be used for patients with multiple sclerosis, right? The nausea and the dizziness and the lack of appetite that happens from chemotherapy, they use that. And the third one would be chronic pain, right? So chronic pain from certain illnesses, they use that. And the chronic pain for hash is less effective than it is for other drugs, but with the antiemetics, which is the nausea and the throwing up that people experience for chemotherapy, it was just as effective as with other drugs. And then the multiple sclerosis, same thing. Keep in mind though, guys, that this is not actual people smoking weed. The doctors are giving them extractions of the marijuana, either synthetic or natural, to come to a certain conclusion, research-wise. Now, seizures and epilepsy, like I said in the previous video, they already have drugs that they're using for it. However, as of now, there's no conclusive, substantial evidence that it actually works. Just case studies and observation by seeing that they do use it. And then there was dementia and Alzheimer's. You know, old people, they get Alzheimer's, they start to forget stuff. That's also a nervous system disease, but they found no evidence that weed can help with that at all, right? Anxiety, respiratory system problems, immune system problems. No studies done on the immune system, although they have done experiments where they'll have, you know, animals or, you know, certain cells in a little petri dish, and they've noticed that weed has immunosuppressive properties, meaning that it lowers your immune system and it makes it weaker, right? So that is there. Anxiety, interestingly enough, heavy weed use is associated with anxiety disorder, right? So it actually causes anxiety, and although a lot of people say that they do it for their anxiety, weed, it can actually be a big cause of anxiety, and this is something that I'm going to go on in the mental health portion of it. So interestingly enough, if a pregnant woman smokes weed, they don't really have any studies on the negative effects. What they only have conclusive evidence for is that smoking weed as a pregnant mom will let your child have a lower birth weight than normal kids. So the kid will weigh less, and that in and of itself is not good. You want a big, healthy, bumpkin kid, you know. But nothing too harsh that they found yet, and that's also very hard to find out. Oh, like 5 years later, something happens to the kid. Was it because of the weed the mom was smoking? It's almost impossible to know, right? So really, they only have conclusive evidence on the birth weight. Psychosocial, meaning their academic performance, their performance with friends, their cognitive abilities. This is the big one, right? Because people have the stereotype that potheads are stupid and weed makes you stupid and lazy, and we don't have conclusive evidence for that, but we do still have evidence for that. And the main evidence is that they do brain scans and brain studies. Problem with brain scans though is because you're looking at the person's brain at a certain point in time. The reason that the studies are not conclusive is because it's very difficult to say that thing in his brain was because of the weed he was smoking. It could have been a third factor, right? It could have been another factor. But what they have found was that in terms of performing mentally and memory and all of that, certain studies have found that weed users are performing exactly the same as non-weed users, but their brain is using a different part than the normal person. So it's called a compensatory effect. So compensation. So basically, you're using more brain power to get the same amount of work done if you're a regular weed user compared to a non-weed user. That's what the brain studies have found, even though externally the performance is the same. Now, other studies, of course, have found that weed use within a certain period of time, within 24 hours, will impair your memory and your cognitive powers, your thinking powers. But they also did studies where they had people who quit weed for 4 weeks, right? People who smoke weed and people who smoke weed, but the second group that smokes weed, they made them quit for 4 weeks, and they found that those guys are better able to perform mentally than the people who still smoke weed on the regular. So quitting for 4 weeks had a positive effect on their mental performance, right? And then there's other studies that say there's no difference, right? It's still up in the air. But they did find that cannabis use or weed use within the 24-hour mark, like if you smoke weed in that whole entire day, you're performing less than you should normally, although other studies are saying otherwise. And again, it still needs to be studied more for conclusive evidence. Moving on to mental health, we have conclusive evidence that weed use, heavy weed use, leads to schizophrenia, or can lead to schizophrenia, right? There's a huge association, statistical association, right? And that study, I was reading that study, that was one of the best studies I have ever seen. No, I wouldn't say it's the best. Probably the best I looked at through that 500-page book. That was the best study I saw. They went through 66,000 individuals across Australia, Europe, New Zealand, and America, right? So that's like 4 different countries. And yeah, I said Europe already, right? So they went through 60,000 individuals. Those people went through all of the different studies that were done at the time. So that's a very big deal. And then the weed use itself was classified on lifetime use, how long the person had been using, how heavy the person had been smoking, comparing to his normal use previously in time. And in terms of scientific studies, it's hard to do, and that's really amazing that they actually did it. Another study actually accounted for 60 different variables. So a variable would be something like, if you're wanting to see how weed affects your lungs, right? And someone is smoking weed and you test him, but he's also smoking cigarettes, that will throw your results of your study off. Why? Because you don't know if the hurtful effect on the lungs was because of the weed or was it because of the cigarettes, right? So studies have to account for that, and sometimes it can be very difficult. But with these mental health studies on mental illnesses, they did account for all of these variables, and that's why the results were conclusive, right? According to the 500-page journal that was published in January, right? So they found that there's a definite association between weed use and developing schizophrenia, meaning when you're no longer in control of your mind. And I can attest to this with my hand and my heart. I have seen it personally, and I have seen it when I was working in the psychiatric hospital, right? So that definitely is there. But I'm not going to talk about my own personal observations. That's going to be for another video, inshallah. So in any case, guys, with bipolar people, they found bipolar meaning that the person has mania, which is a period where they have a lot of energy, and they have another period of depression where they're very sad. That's called bipolar disorder, and there's different types of spectrums of bipolar disorder, but they found that weed use doesn't cause bipolar. However, bipolar people who smoke weed get their, like, if they recover from being in a bipolar phase, if they smoke weed, they'll go back to that phase faster. They'll relapse faster into the bipolarness, and it'll take longer for them to recover. So those studies were done too. I don't remember if that was conclusive or if it was substantial evidence for that. But the studies done in this regard were definitely very well done. Anyways, guys, that's about it. I don't think I talked about the respiratory system and the lungs and the effect on the lungs. The studies done, again, is not that much evidence because it's difficult to control for all the different variables and factors, right? Like cigarettes and all of this. So not too much studies done. So a lot of these studies surprisingly did not measure the total years of smoking. So that's also a big one. Like, how can you say certain XYZ affects your body when you don't even know how many years the person has been doing it? So keep in mind, guys, that I'm done with this video, but just keep in mind that some of you might be like, huh? What do you mean? It's obvious that weed does this. It's obvious that weed does this. There's a difference between it being obvious with what you see with your eyes and it being scientifically proven, right? Because it might be obvious to you, but that's not enough for a scientific study. A scientific study needs to make 1,000,000% sure that that thing that you're seeing is actually because of what you think it's linked to. So you might see someone smoke cigarettes and his lungs hurt him. And you might say it's obvious that cigarettes hurt your lungs because I know someone who smokes cigarettes and he's not good at playing sports. He always gets tired really quickly. That's a good observation, But scientifically, you'd have to test that out and compare 100 people who smoke cigarettes to 100 people who don't smoke at all, and then the cigarette use, we have to compare those cigarette users for people who have been smoking for a year versus people who have been smoking for 2 years versus people who have been smoking 1 cigarette a day versus people who have been smoking 1 pack a day. And you have to do all these comparisons, and you have to compare it to, there's a lot that goes into it before you can say, okay, this is I have done my studies according to the scientific method, my results are valid. Because if you don't do it in the correct way, your results will not be valid, even if it's obvious to people, So hopefully that sheds some light upon this, and inshallah I'll go to my next video. Stay tuned. Peace out. Assalamu alaikum.